With the bonfire lit, the story begins. Okiku, the doll that never dies. Japan. When an antique collector, Ethan Carter, acquires a rare Japanese doll for his exhibition, he has no idea that he brought home something other than an artifact. The doll, called Okiku, hides a terrifying secret. Her hair grows as if she were alive, and mysterious whispers echo through the house every night. Ethan's investigation takes him to Japan, where he discovers that the doll belonged to a girl who died more than a century ago. But his search for the truth quickly turns into a nightmare with no escape. As Okiku's story unfolds, he realizes he is dealing with something more than a vengeful spirit. There is an ancient presence hungry for something more than revenge. The legend is real, and Ethan is about to discover that some stories never end. They just meet new characters. Ethan Carter never believed in legends. As a seasoned antique collector, I had heard countless stories about cursed objects, possessed dolls, and mirrors that reflected more than just reality. For him, it was all just tricks to increase the market value. But when he received an exclusive invitation to an underground auction of rare artifacts in Kyoto, he couldn't resist. The auction took place in an abandoned temple, lit only by flickering candles and the amber glow of ancient lanterns. The smell of burning incense mixed with the damp aroma of aged wood, creating a suffocating environment. Among the exotic pieces, samurai masks, ancient scrolls, and protective talismans, a doll caught his attention. Sitting on a dark wooden pedestal, her blue silk kimono looked almost new despite its supposed centuries-old age. But what really grabbed Ethan was the doll's hair. Unlike ordinary synthetic hair, this hair looked human, with a disturbing natural shine. The auctioneer, an elderly man with a wrinkled face and piercing gaze, described the item in a grave tone. "This is Okiku. Whoever possesses it will never be alone." An enigmatic smile crossed his lips. "But be warned, not all company is welcome." Ethan chuckled discreetly. For him, that was pure marketing. When the gavel hit confirming his purchase, he felt victorious. He had acquired not only a valuable artifact, but also a legend to tell. As he left with the carefully packaged doll, one of the event organizers discreetly pulled him aside. He was a younger man with worried features. "Sir, I beg you, give her back. There are things that shouldn't be taken home." Ethan let out a short laugh. "Do you really believe that?" The man didn't respond, just lowered his head, and murmured, "Just be careful and never leave her alone in the dark." Back at his New York apartment, Ethan unwrapped the doll and placed it on a shelf alongside other Japanese relics. During the first few days, nothing happened. No spectral apparitions, no objects flying alone, just the usual silence of your apartment. He felt foolish for even considering that something supernatural could happen. But one morning he noticed something strange. The doll's hair looked different. He took a photo taken on the day of purchase and compared it. A shiver ran down his spine. Before, her hair barely passed her shoulders. Now it touched her waist. Maybe it was just an optical illusion, a trick of the mind. Deciding to test it, he took scissors and cut a short strand. The next day, to his horror, the hairs were long again, as if they had never been cut. That same night, something even more disturbing happened. Ethan woke up with a start to a noise coming from the bookshelf. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the sliding of fabric over wood. He stood up, feeling along the wall for the switch. When he looked at the doll, he felt a deep chill. Okiku was no longer sitting like before. She had tilted her head slightly to the side, as if she was looking directly at him. His heart raced. Maybe it was just his imagination, a trick of the shadows created by the dim light from the lamp. But when Ethan picked up the doll to inspect it, something cold ran across his skin. The sensation was like touching something alive. Dampness, a subtle heat that shouldn't be there. Tossing the doll back onto the shelf, he laughed nervously. I need to sleep better, he muttered to himself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, he locked his bedroom door, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt genuine fear. The next morning, Ethan woke up with an uncomfortable feeling, as if he had spent the night being watched. The sun had barely risen when he got out of bed and cast a wary glance at the shelf where he had left Okiku the night before. To her relief, or perhaps discomfort, the doll was still in the same place. However, something felt off. Her hair was even longer, almost touching the wood of the shelf. He blinked a few times, trying to dismiss the thought, but he knew it wasn't imagination. As the day went on, small occurrences began to bother him. The door to his office creaked as if it was being slowly opened, but when he checked, there was never anyone there. The lights flickered without explanation, and the radio turned on by itself, always emitting static before tuning into an old, distorted melody. What bothered him most, however, was the growing feeling that he was not alone at home. One night, while reviewing some documents, a peculiar sound caught his attention. The noise was subtle, a light dragging, like fabric brushing, against wood. He slowly got up and went to the shelf. His stomach dropped as he noticed the doll was in a different position. Before, his hands were resting in his lap, but now they seemed slightly raised, as if he was about to touch something, or someone. Ethan felt a shiver run up his spine, but he refused to give in to fear. He picked up the doll with firm hands and examined it more closely. The porcelain skin felt cold, but so soft, almost real. He pressed his lips together, trying to convince himself that he was just tired, that this was all one big coincidence. But then something happened that he couldn't ignore. As he put it back on the shelf, a high-pitched sound echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. It seemed to be coming from the front door. He walked over there and looked through the peephole. Nothing. He opened the door slowly and faced the empty hallway. The silence was absolute except for the cold wind that passed through him like a whisper. As soon as he closed the door, he heard an even worse sound, the creaking of something moving inside the apartment. His heart raced. He slowly turned around and his eyes widened when he saw the doll now lying on the floor, face down, as if it had been dropped. But he knew that no one touched her. His hands shook slightly as he replaced it on the shelf, taking a deep breath. "This isn't happening," he muttered. But deep down, a part of you already knew it was happening, yes. Night came, and with it, a growing fear. Ethan went to bed, trying to ignore the suffocating feeling that something was at the foot of his bed. The sleep was restless, full of nightmares with children's laughter echoing in empty rooms. In the midst of his reverie, a phrase was whispered in his ear, cold and unmistakable. "Why did you bring me?" He woke up with a start, his chest rising and falling rapidly. In the corner of the room, near the half-open door, the doll was sitting, but he remembered leaving it in the room. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. Ethan tried to ignore the fear gnawing at his mind. After the last night, he convinced himself that he was just exhausted, that the doll moving could be a lapse in memory. But something inside him knew that wasn't true. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the apartment became heavy, as if the air was denser, colder. He began to have difficulty sleeping because, whenever he closed his eyes, he felt the distinct sensation that something was watching him. When I finally managed to fall asleep, the nightmares came. At first, he was in a dark field with dense fog around him. The muffled sound of a child's laughter echoed in the distance. He turned his body, trying to find the source of the sound, but all he saw was a small, motionless silhouette. As he got closer, he realized it was a girl with long, dark hair, wearing a blue kimono. His face was partially hidden by his disheveled strands, but his mouth was murmuring something. "Ethan. Ethan. Why did you bring me?" He woke up suddenly, his heart racing and his body covered in cold sweat. He tried to calm his breathing, telling himself it was just a dream, but when he looked at the bedroom door, he saw a shadow slowly pass through the lower doorway. He stood still, paralyzed. There was no one else in the apartment, Or at least there shouldn't be. The following dawns brought more torment. Whispers echoed through the room whenever Ethan was about to sleep. Indistinct sentences, words in Japanese, that he didn't understand. Some nights he would wake up feeling a weight on his chest, as if something was sitting on him, making it impossible to move or scream. In the few seconds that he was paralyzed, he could hear the sound of low breathing near his ear, followed by a subtle laugh. One night he decided to record while he slept. He left his cell phone next to the bed, camera facing him, and tried to rest. Sleep came, but was abruptly interrupted at 3:33 in the morning. He woke up breathless, his body in a cold sweat, without remembering exactly what he dreamed about. He picked up his cell phone with shaking hands and played the video. For long minutes, everything seemed normal, just him tossing and turning in bed. But then, just before waking up, something changed. The screen was distorted for a few seconds, as if there was interference. And then, in the corner of the room, a figure appeared, small, with long dark hair, wearing a blue kimono. Her face wasn't visible, just her head tilted to the side as if watching Ethan sleep. And then, in a move impossible to ignore, she stepped forward. The screen went black in the next instant. Ethan dropped his cell phone on the floor. His eyes widened, his breathing quickened. He was sleeping alone that night, but clearly he wasn't alone. That morning, he didn't sleep anymore. The next morning, Ethan couldn't focus on anything other than the video he had recorded. He watched it countless times, pausing and zooming in, trying to find some logical explanation. But there wasn't. The girl was there. And the most frightening thing was her appearance. The same blue kimono that the doll was wearing, the same straight black hair that grew inexplicably. That couldn't be a coincidence. Determined to find answers, Ethan began obsessively researching the doll's origins. He scoured collector forums, historical archives, and even academic articles on Japanese folklore. After hours of reading, he finally found a clue. An old Japanese newspaper dated 1918 mentioned a doll with the same name, kept in a temple on the island of Hokkaido. The story told of a girl named Okiku, who tragically died at the age of 3. According to the story, Okiku became seriously ill in the harsh winter of 1910. Her favorite doll never left her hands, and when she passed away, her family placed it at the altar as a way of remembering the girl. But, over the years, something strange happened. The doll's hair began to grow on its own. The temple's monks who inherited the object guaranteed that it was real. Examinations carried out by scientists confirmed that the strands were, in fact, human hair. Ethan felt a chill as he read the article. Her doll also had hair that grew. Had he acquired the real Okiku, or a copy of it, equally cursed? And more importantly, if the doll held the girl's spirit, then what was haunting her house? The collector decided to contact a Japanese historian who specialized in ancient artifacts. He found an expert named Hiroshi Tanaka, a professor of folklore at the University of Tokyo. He wrote a detailed email explaining everything: the purchase of the doll, the strange phenomena, and even the video he recorded. In less than an hour, he received a short and objective response. "Mr. Carter, if what you say is true, you are in great danger. That doll should never have left Japan. The legend is true, but the spirit inside it does not just belong to Okiku. Something much worse may have attached itself to it. If you want to know more, come to Japan. I will explain it in person. But come quickly." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. What did Tanaka mean by something worse? He reread the message several times, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Something inside him told him that this trip wouldn't just be a search for answers. It would be a race against time. That night, Ethan did something he never imagined he would do. He took the doll and locked it inside a wooden box, tying it with ropes. He needed to buy time, but as he turned off the lights and lay in bed, a voice whispered in the dark, "Why did you hide me?" Ethan felt his skin go cold. He didn't respond. He just closed his eyes and wished the night would pass quickly. The next morning, he bought his ticket to Japan. The plane landed at Narita International Airport amid a gray, heavy sky. Ethan felt a weight on his chest as soon as he got off the plane. What had once seemed like simple curiosity about an ancient relic had now become a search for answers he might not want to hear. He took a taxi to central Tokyo and went directly to the university where Hiroshi Tanaka worked. The historian had been surprisingly receptive to his request for help, but his hasty and cryptic response indicated that the matter was more serious than Ethan cared to admit. Upon arrival, he was greeted by a thin man with round glasses and gray hair carefully combed back. Tanaka greeted him formally and led him to his office, where shelves crammed with ancient books, scrolls, and archaeological relics indicated years of dedicated research. He wasted no time. "Did you bring the doll?" asked Tanaka in a serious tone. Ethan hesitated before answering. "No, I left her in the States, but something is wrong with her." Tanaka sighed and opened a drawer, pulling out an old dossier. He spread some yellowed photos on the table. Ethan felt a chill when he saw the image of the same doll he had purchased, only this photo was dated 1930. "This is Okiku," said Tanaka. "The original. It was kept in a temple for decades. But what you have isn't just a replica, it's something much worse." Ethan was silent, absorbing the historian's words. "The stories about the hair growing back are true," Tanaka continued. "But what no one mentions is that over time, the monks realized that Okiku was not alone. Something else was inside the doll, something that didn't belong to the girl." Ethan felt a chill run up his spine. "Anything else?" Tanaka nodded slowly. "We call this fake Yurei. It is not the child's soul that remains, but something that uses her as bait. Okiku may have been the gateway, but what manifests is no longer the girl." The collector felt his mouth go dry. Every night he spent with the doll in his house, every whisper, every appearance in his nightmares, everything now made sense. "What should I do?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Tanaka took a deep breath before responding. "If she has already chosen you, then perhaps there is no escape left." Ethan felt his body shudder. He traveled to the other side of the world in search of answers. But deep down, I knew I was already in too much. The trip to Japan brought more questions than answers. Ethan spent the night in a small hotel in the Shinjuku district, unable to sleep. Tanaka's words echoed in his mind. "If she has already chosen you, then perhaps there is no longer any way to escape." He tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for everything, but something inside him knew that was impossible. He was dealing with something that transcended logic. Upon returning to the United States, he felt a growing discomfort before he even entered his apartment. The lights in the hallway seemed dimmer, and the air was unusually cold. He turned the key in the lock, hesitating for a moment before entering. The silence was sepulchral. The box where he had locked the doll was still on the living room table, intact, but he felt a shiver when he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small tuft of black hair stuck to the side of the lid. He walked forward slowly, feeling his heart speed up. He opened the box cautiously, and his eyes widened. The doll was no longer there. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He locked the doll, tied her up, and now it was gone. A subtle sound came from the next room. A rustle of fabric, as if something small was moving in the dark. With shaking hands, he took out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight. The light illuminated the hallway to her room, and her heart almost stopped when she saw the doll sitting on her bed. Her tiny hands rested in her lap, but her head was tilted slightly, as if she were looking directly at the door. Ethan stepped back, swallowing hard. This is not possible. He felt a cold sweat run down the back of his neck, but he summoned the courage to enter the room and catch her. The doll felt heavier than before. The kimono was slightly wrinkled as if it had been handled. He placed her on the floor and took a deep breath. That night, tiredness overcame him. He lay down, but his sleep was restless. At some point in the morning, he woke up with a strange sensation, a weight on his legs. The room was dark, but something was there with him. Something was pulling at the covers. slowly. He held his breath and tried to move, but a paralyzing cold ran through his body. The covers continued to slide down, revealing her feet. His heart was beating so hard that he felt the pulse in his ears. Then came the sound, a whisper, low, almost childish. "Ethan, you brought me back." The air became heavy. The surrounding darkness seemed to swallow everything. He couldn't take it. He jumped out of bed and turned on all the lights in the room, breathing heavily. He looked around, his chest rising and falling uncontrollably. Nothing. But as he turned to the door, his eyes froze. The doll was now sitting on the floor, right next to the bed. Ethan didn't sleep again after that night. The doll seemed to play with his sanity, appearing in different places, moving without explanation. But the worst thing was the presence. He felt something there, something he couldn't see but was constantly watching him. After another terrifying episode, in which he woke up with superficial scratches on his chest, he made the definitive decision. He needed to get rid of the doll. The first person that came to his mind was Hiroshi Tanaka. The Japanese historian was the only person who seemed to know the truth about Okiku and the entity that inhabited the doll. With hands shaking, Ethan called him in the middle of the night. Tanaka immediately answered, as if he had been waiting for that call. "You need to go back to Japan now. I've tried to lock her away, I've tried to throw her away, but she always comes back," Ethan murmured, feeling a lump tighten in his throat. "This won't stop until you return it to where it came from." The next morning, Ethan bought the fastest ticket he could, and 24 hours later he was landing in Japan again. He and Tanaka traveled together to Hokkaido, where a small temple in the mountains held the legend of the original doll. The place was isolated, surrounded by dense forests and an almost supernatural silence. As Ethan walked through the worn wooden gates, he felt a rush of déjà vu, as if he had been there before. The monks received them without surprise. They seemed to know exactly the reason for their visit. One of them, an elderly man with a stern expression, led Ethan to a room where the original Okiku was still kept. He hesitated before entering, but when he did, he held his breath. The doll was there behind a glass display case identical to the one he had brought home. The same blue kimono, the same long black hair. But there was something different. Her eyes seemed more alive, more penetrating, as if they were aware of his presence. "You are not the first Westerner to try to solve this mystery," said the monk, interrupting Ethan's thoughts. "Others came before, but none came back to tell the tale." Ethan turned slowly, feeling an icy shiver run up his spine. "What happened to them?" The monk looked at him for a long moment before replying. "They disappeared." The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan felt a presence beside him, a cold seeping into his skin. Something whispered right next to his ear, a dark, childish voice. "You should never have taken me." The silence in the temple was sepulchral. Ethan felt the weight of the monk's words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Others had already tried to discover the truth about Okiku. None of them returned. He swallowed hard and looked at the doll behind the glass again. Those dark glass eyes seemed to look into him, as if probing his soul. "What happened to these people?" he asked, his voice slightly shaking. The older monk closed his eyes for a moment, as if weighing his words before answering them. "They thought they were just dealing with Okiku, but they were wrong. Very wrong." Ethan frowned, confused. "Isn't the girl's spirit alone?" Tanaka, who had remained silent until then, spoke. "There are entities that feed on suffering. Lost spirits can be used as anchors for something much older and more dangerous." The right monk nodded and picked up an ancient scroll, slowly unrolling it on the table. The illustration showed a shadowy figure, shrouded in shadow, with long arms and sharp claws, looming over a child kneeling before it. "We call this Yami no Kami, the god of shadows. He has no form of his own. He cannot exist in the physical world without a vessel. Spirits like Okiku's serve as a bridge for him to cross the border between worlds." Ethan felt his stomach drop. That explained everything. It wasn't just Okiku that was haunting his house. It was something much worse, something that used the girl's energy to manifest itself. And the longer you have it, the stronger this entity becomes, added Tanaka. His expression charged. Ethan ran his hands over his face, feeling the tension weigh on his shoulders. It now made sense why events had become more and more intense. At first it was just whispers, then moving objects, then the nightmares, the cold touch tugging at your covers. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being prepared for something. The older monk approached, his voice solemn. The question that remains is, do you want to free Okiku, or do you want to survive? Ethan froze. He had never thought of it that way. He wanted to end the curse, yes. But how far were you willing to go? What if the only way out was to surrender to the entity in the doll's place? The silence between the three men was broken by a sharp sound, a crack like cracking glass. The three of them turned their heads at the same time. The display case where the original doll was stored now had a crack, small but growing. The doll knew they were talking about her. The silence that followed the crack of the glass was overwhelming. Ethan held his breath, hoping it was just his imagination. But it wasn't. The crack in the window slowly widened, as if the doll itself was trying to get out. The older monk closed his eyes, muttering a prayer. "We don't have much time," he said, quickly grabbing an old parchment from a shelf. "If the entity is reacting, it means it knows we are trying to stop it." Ethan swallowed hard as the monk unrolled the parchment on the table. The worn pages were filled with kanji inscriptions and ancient drawings. One of them caught attention, a circle surrounded by symbols, with a small figure in the center, a doll, and around her shadowy hands trying to grab her. "This ritual can free Okiku and trap the entity once again in the void," Tanaka explained, pointing to the details on the scroll. "But there is a risk. If not done correctly, the Yami no Kami could break free completely." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. "What if that happens?" The monk looked at him with a dark expression. "Then there will be nothing more we can do. He will find another vessel, and the curse will spread forever." The weight of the choice fell on Ethan like a blow. He wanted to get rid of the doll, but not at the expense of releasing something much worse into the world. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't keep living like this. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice firm, even with his heart racing. The monk began to explain. The ritual required the doll to be placed within a sacred circle, surrounded by candles and ancestral inscriptions. Ethan would need to recite the liberation verses while holding the doll and burning strands of his own hair as an offering, a symbolic act of energy exchange. But the scariest thing was the end of the ritual. Okiku would need to accept his release voluntarily. If she resisted, it meant that the entity had already taken full control, and then there would be no going back. "If at any point you feel something is wrong, stop," warned the monk. "Interrupting the ritual may be your only chance of survival." Ethan nodded, feeling the tension weigh on him. That night, he would sleep for the last time before the ritual. But something told him that the moment he closed his eyes, he wouldn't be alone in his room. And he was right. In the middle of the night, something woke him up, a low, repetitive sound coming from the floor next to the bed. Talk. 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 His heart froze. He slowly turned his head to the side. The doll was there, sitting on the floor, with head tilted, and then she smiled. Ethan felt his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the doll on the floor. The subtle smile on her porcelain lips was impossible. Dolls don't smile. He blinked several times, the air heavy around him. The room seemed darker, shadows creeping into the corners. He knew this was a warning. "Don't do that. Don't try to get me out of here." But there was no turning back. He stood up, took the doll with trembling hands, and locked it inside the wooden box the monks had given him. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he knew she was aware. The next night, he followed the monks' instructions and set up the protective circle in the temple. The room was lit only by candles arranged around the doll, each marked with ancient symbols. In the center, Ethan knelt, holding a small handful of his own hair between his fingers. He could do no wrong. He began to recite the sacred verses, his voice firm but full of tension. The room seemed to vibrate as if something invisible was writhing around it. The air became thick, difficult to breathe. Then, in the third verse, everything got out of control. The candle flames flickered violently, and then suddenly went out at the same time. An unbearable cold took over the environment. Ethan felt an invisible weight on his shoulders. The silence was broken by a childish whisper coming from all directions. "I don't want to go." The doll shook slightly inside the box. He gripped the lid tightly, but a shockwave threw him back, knocking him to the ground. The box opened with a bang, and then Ethan saw Okiku. She was there. But it wasn't just a doll anymore. A black mist rose from the ground, shaping itself into the figure of a little girl, dressed in a blue kimono. His face was pale, his eyes had no pupils, just two white cavities. She opened her mouth, but the scream that came out was impossible. A low, distorted sound, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. The shadows in the room began to twist, lengthening until they reached Ethan. He tried to crawl back, but something grabbed his ankle. Spectral hands reaching out from the ground. The monk shouted from outside the room, "Stop! The ritual is wrong!" But it was too late. Ethan felt the icy touch of shadows enveloping his throat. He had released something, but it wasn't Okiku. The air around Ethan became thick, as if he was being sucked out of the temple. The icy grip around his throat tightened, and his vision blurred. He tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. Then, in the blink of an eye, the world around him disappeared. He was no longer in the temple. The ground beneath his feet was a misty void, no texture, no color. The sky above was pitch black. No stars, no moon, no end. Everything was oppressive darkness, but at the same time, he knew he wasn't alone. So he listened. Hiccups, small, stuffy. Ethan slowly turned around and saw the silhouettes of children, in the distance, standing in the fog. Their bodies seemed blurred, specters caught between the world of the living and the dead. Their heads were bowed, and each of them held something in their arms. Dolls, all identical to Okiku. Ethan felt a lump tighten in his throat. Those were the souls that the entity had imprisoned. "Ethan," the childish voice echoed behind him, making his body shiver completely. He turned around and came face to face with her. Okiku. But this time she didn't look like a doll. She looked like a real child. His blue kimono was dirty and torn. His eyes were empty like the abyss around him. "Did you come to get me?" she asked, her voice sweet and at the same time unsettling. Ethan tried to speak, but something in his mind screamed not to respond. He just stood still, waiting for her to continue. "They all came before you," Okiku said, gesturing to the children in the mist. "But they never made it out." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Was he trapped there too? "You tried to free me?" Okiku whispered, slowly approaching. "But he won't let me." Before Ethan could ask who he was, a colossal shadow appeared behind the girl. Two enormous, misshapen hands reached out from the darkness, elongated fingers and sharp claws, wrapping around Okiku like living currents. She didn't scream. He just smiled sadly. And it was then that Ethan understood the truth. Okiku was never truly evil. She was the bait, and now he was the next prey. Okiku's sad smile froze Ethan in place. He felt the weight of the revelation before she even spoke. She didn't want to be released. The very idea was absurd. He'd traveled halfway around the world to free that child, faced terrors beyond his understanding. And now she said she didn't want to leave? "You don't understand, Ethan," Okiku murmured, his empty eyes reflecting the spectral mist around him. "I'm not what you think I am." The deformed hands emerging from the darkness wrapped around the girl, slowly pulling her back, but she remained, still, accepting it as an inevitable sentence. Ethan felt his body freeze. "We tried to warn you," Okiku continued, as the other spectral children in the distance cowered, hugging their identical dolls. "I am not the key to breaking the curse. I am the chain that keeps it bound." Ethan felt his breathing hitch. He was wrong all along. The doll was never just a prison for Okiku. It was an anchor for something much older, much hungrier. The girl's spirit was just what kept the entity contained. If she were released, the creature would break free completely. "But I saw you in my dreams," Ethan murmured, trying to understand. "You called me, asked me to free you." Okiku shook his head slowly. "No, it wasn't me." An icy shiver ran down his spine. "He whispers in my voice he needs you to free me, Ethan, because if I disappear, he will be free to roam." And then it all made sense. The growing torment in your home. The dolls, subtle smile, the childish voice whispering in the dark. None of that was Okiku, it was always him. The colossal shadow that trapped her began to twitch, as if realizing that Ethan had finally understood. The dark sky shook. The reality around him seemed to fragment. The entity knew he was hesitating. "If you go back, you'll stop the ritual, won't you?" Okiku asked softly. "Are you going to keep me here?" Ethan had never felt so scared. Because now he had a choice. Free Okiku and unleash ultimate evil on the world, or leave it there, forever. Ethan felt his heart hammering against his chest. Everything he thought he knew about the doll and about Okiku was wrong. She never wanted to be saved. Not because he liked that place, but because its existence was the only thing preventing something much worse from escaping. The monstrous shadow behind her expanded, growing as if it fed on Ethan's own fear. The elongated, misshapen fingers stretched toward him, trembling with excitement. The creature no longer needed to hide. Now that he knew the truth, it could reveal itself. "Do you understand now?" Okiku whispered, his voice sounding more distant, more ethereal. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Ethan's eyes widened. His body froze. "What?" The girl looked at him with deep regret. "Do you think it was a coincidence?" asked Okiku. "The doll coming to you, the auction, the subtle signs drawing you more and more to me." Ethan felt his mind spinning. He thought he had found the doll. But now he was beginning to realize the terrifying truth. The doll had found him. He needs someone to start the cycle over again. Okiku continued, his voice broken. "You need someone to spread your influence, someone to carry you back to the real world?" Ethan felt an icy shiver run down his spine. If other people had disappeared trying to understand the doll, then how many came before him? How many had been chosen to be the next bearers of the curse? The entity laughed, a low, guttural sound like hundreds of distorted voices overlapping. The shadows around him pulsed, and Ethan felt his body being pulled back, as if he was being sucked out of this world. "You can go now, Ethan," Okiku said, his expression grim. "But when you wake up, you'll realize that the doll is still with you." Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed him completely. Ethan woke with a start, panting as if he had emerged from a deep nightmare. His hands were shaking, and his body was covered in cold sweat. He blinked several times, trying to get his bearings. He was still in the temple. The candles had gone out, and the monks watched him with grave expressions. Tanaka was kneeling, beside you, holding your shoulder firmly. "You're back," the historian murmured, as if in disbelief. "But something came back with you?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words died before they could be formed. The feeling of cold persisted, as if a shadow still surrounded him. His eyes wandered around the room until his stomach dropped. The doll was there, intact, exactly as before. He felt panic creep through his chest. He didn't bring it with him, did he? The older monk approached and touched Ethan's forehead with 2 fingers, reciting a prayer in a low, monotone tone. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he almost screamed. Okiku was right behind the monk. She didn't move, it didn't blink, but her empty eyes were fixed on him. Ethan blinked, and she disappeared. He backed away, his heart pounding. "I'm marked," he whispered. "I can't run away from her anymore." That night, Ethan returned to the hotel with Tanaka, but was unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Okiku in the corners of the room, standing in the darkness, just waiting. The next day, while drinking coffee and checking his cell phone, he felt a chill as he scrolled through the photos in the gallery. She was there. Among random images from his trip, there was a photo taken at the temple, one he hadn't taken. In the image, Ethan was sleeping, and Okiku was next to him, tilting her head as if watching him. He dropped his cell phone on the floor and jumped out of his chair. This can't be happening, but it was, and it was just beginning. Ethan never wanted to return to the United States, but he knew that staying in Japan wouldn't change anything. He was marked, and Okiku wouldn't leave him alone. The flight back was torture. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the doll among the passengers, sitting in the aisle, in the empty seat next to him, peering at the reflection in the window. He refused to sleep. When he finally landed in New York, exhausted, he realized that his home would never be a refuge again. Darkness was already waiting for him. Upon entering the apartment, he felt a chill. The place felt different. He turned. On the lights, checked every corner. The doll wasn't there. Maybe he would have stayed in the temple. Maybe he would have escaped. But then, in the middle of the night, he heard it. Talk, talk, talk. It came from the closet. Ethan's blood ran cold. He remained motionless on the bed, breathing ragged. For a moment, he tried to convince himself that it was just the building creaking or his mind playing tricks. But the sound came again, this time accompanied by a familiar whisper. "Why did you bring me back?" His heart almost exploded. He jumped out of bed and opened the closet in one fell swoop. Nothing. No sign of the doll, no sign of anything. But the cold that escaped the cramped space was intense, unnatural. The next, Ethan did what anyone would do in his position. He tried to get rid of the doll. First, he burned it. He conducted the ritual with trembling hands, watching the flames consume the small porcelain body. The smell of burning hair permeated the air, making him gag. He stood there, watching until the last trace turned to ash. But that night, when he returned home, he felt a chill when he saw something in his bed. Okiku was back, intact. So he tried to bury her. He drove to a distant forest, dug a deep hole and threw the doll inside. He covered it with dirt, making sure no one would ever find it. When he returned to his apartment, he locked all the doors and windows, trying to convince himself that he was free. But as he entered the room, his stomach dropped. She was there, sitting on the pillow. Finally, he tried to sell it. He created an online ad offering it as a rare Japanese artifact. A mysterious collector made the purchase immediately. Ethan mailed the package, not even wanting to touch her again. For a moment, he felt relief. Maybe he had finally gotten rid of her. But when he woke up the next day, he found a small package on the doorstep of his apartment, the same one I had sent. The recipient's address was scrawled out, as if no one had been there to greet it. He opened the box with shaking hands. The doll was there, and this time she had changed position. Her hands, previously resting in her lap, were now outstretched, as if waiting for him to hold her. Ethan fell to his knees. He could never get rid of her. The curse didn't want a new owner. She wanted him. Ethan felt like he was on the verge of madness. No matter what he did, Okiku always came back. The doll wasn't just a haunted object. She was a bond between him and something much older, something that fed on fear and submission. He needed help. In his desperation, he began looking for alternatives that went beyond the rationale. Exorcisms, purification rituals, occult experts, anything that could break the curse. That's how he found Kenji Moriyama, a Japanese shaman who lived on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The stories about him were strange, but one thing was certain. He had dealt with things like this before. The shaman received Ethan in a hut far from the city. decorated with talismans, candles, and incense that burned non-stop. As soon as Ethan entered, Moriyama didn't even ask for an explanation. He already knew. "She chose you," said the shaman, dark eyes boring into Ethan's. "And now you can't just send her away. She no longer needs the doll to exist." Ethan shuddered. "What do I do?" Moriyama took a deep breath and pulled out a scroll of ancient scrolls. His wrinkled hands shook slightly as he unfolded the papers, revealing a forbidden ritual. The kanji were complex, written in a dark ink that looked closer to blood than regular ink. "This is the only ritual that can imprison her forever," Moriyama explained. "But it demands a price." Ethan felt the air become heavy. "What kind of price?" The shaman looked at him with a stern expression. "A sacrifice. A soul must give itself completely to take its place. Someone must take its place and hold the entity within the void." Ethan's panic intensified. This meant that to get rid of the curse, someone would have to suffer eternally in her place. He swallowed hard. "What if I don't?" Moriyama hesitated before answering. "So there's no way to stop the entity from consuming you. Sooner or later, you'll be just another missing person, and the doll will find a new owner." Ethan's blood ran cold. He was faced with an impossible choice: saving yourself at the cost of someone else's soul, or accept his fate and become just another piece in Okiku's never-ending story. The silence that followed Moriyama's revelation was absolute. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Someone would have to be sacrificed. Someone would have to step into the entity's shoes for him to be free. He thought about it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the choice crush him. He might just meet a stranger, someone whose face he would never see again. It could fool someone, make someone else pay the price for their curiosity. But deep down, Ethan knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he did that. "What if I do the ritual without the sacrifice?" he asked, his voice breaking. Moriyama looked up slowly. "There are no guarantees it will work." Ethan took a deep breath. "But is there a chance?" The shaman was silent for a moment. Then he sighed and nodded. "Yes, but you will have to face the entity alone, in its space, in its world. If you weaken, you will not return." Ethan had no doubts. He had already lost nights of sleep. His sanity was slipping away and the curse seemed to grow inside him. If he failed, the doll would find a new owner, and the cycle would continue. He couldn't let that happen. "I'll do it today." Moriyama prepared everything. The ritual would be conducted in a remote forest, where the connection between the worlds was weaker. The circle was drawn on the floor with thick black powder, and the doll was placed in the center. Ethan knelt before her, his hands sweating coldly. "Once you start, don't stop," warned Moriyama. "If Okiku resists, it's because the entity doesn't want to leave. You need to hold it inside." Ethan nodded and began reciting the verses. His voice was low at first, but as he spoke, the wind began to roar through the trees. The surrounding candles flickered violently, as if they would be extinguished at any moment. Then, the doll moved. The glass eyes blinked. Ethan felt the ground shake, and before he could react, he was pulled back, dragged by an invisible force. Darkness swallowed him completely. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the void, back to the entity's domain, and this time she was waiting for him. The void around Ethan seemed to pulse like a living organism, dense, opaque, cold. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as if he were being sucked into the darkness. Then a familiar voice echoed around him. "You shouldn't have tried." The colossal shadow emerged from the darkness. The misshapen hands reached out, the long, twisted fingers trembling with anticipation. The entity was furious. The ritual didn't weaken her, it just angered her. "You think you can arrest me, deny me, you're just another..." The voice reverberated as if it came from inside Ethan, from inside him. It was then that he realized the entity was not trying to escape. She was trying to take over her body. The invisible force pulled him back. The air disappeared from his lungs. The entity infiltrated his mind, turning over his memories, his fear, his despair. He tried to resist, tried to scream, but there was no more sound. Ethan was disappearing, until he listened. No? The voice was low but cutting, feminine Okiku. She appeared in the mist, her blue kimono fluttering around her small, pale body. But this time she didn't look fragile. She looked determined. The entity hesitated. Get out of the way. But Okiku remained motionless. You can't take him. Ethan tried to speak, but something was stopping him. He just watched, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Why was she helping? The entity writhed, the shadow wavering around them. You are nothing but an empty vessel, roared the entity. Okiku tilted his head slightly and smiled. No more. And then, with impossible speed, Okiku advanced. She launched herself at the entity, enveloping it in a forced hug. The creature screamed, the darkness shaking around it. The girl was sacrificing herself, but not as the entity wanted. Ethan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The strength that kept him trapped was ripped away. The entity was being pulled back, and then everything exploded into white light. Ethan opened his eyes with a jolt. The ritual was over. The forest around him was completely silent. The candles had been extinguished, the circle drawn on the floor now in ash. The doll was still there, but something was different. She no longer had eyes. The porcelain was cracked. Okiku is gone. Moriyama approached slowly, looking at the broken doll with a wary expression. She trapped the entity inside her, voluntarily. Ethan blinked, trying to process everything. Why? The shaman took a deep breath. Because now, for the first time, Okiku has control. Ethan looked at the doll again. The blue kimono seemed darker, as if something inside her was changing, adapting. The entity was imprisoned, but Okiku wasn't the same anymore, and Ethan had a terrible feeling that she wasn't done yet. The wind in the forest stopped. The world seemed trapped in an instant, frozen in time. Ethan was still kneeling in front of the doll, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind trying to process everything that had just happened. The entity had been imprisoned. But something didn't feel right. Okiku was different. He felt a chill run down his spine when the doll's lips moved. The choice is yours, Ethan. The voice was not the entity's guttural distortion. It was Okiku. He widened his eyes, unable to speak. I can free him, she continued, her voice sweet and calm. But someone else will find the doll one day. The cycle never stops, Ethan. It never has. Ethan felt the weight of the decision crush him. The other option? His voice came out as a dry whisper. Silence hovered before the answer came. Let him take you. Ethan's heart almost stopped. What? If you offer yourself, Okiku said softly, the cycle will be broken. The entity will have a new vessel. You. And then, I can rest. Ethan felt the ground spin. That was his choice. He could allow the being to possess him, sacrificing himself to seal the curse forever. Or she could lock him in the doll again, knowing that someone somewhere one day would find her, and everything would start again. He closed his eyes, his mind racing with the decision. He wanted to live. But could it carry the weight of condemning someone else to the same fate? Time was running out. Okiku was waiting for his answer. Ethan took a deep breath, and so he chose. The auctioneer's gavel banged against the wooden plinth, sealing the sale. Lot 66 sold to the gentleman in the third row. The young collector smiled, satisfied with his acquisition. He watched intently as auction assistants packed the piece into a carefully velvet-lined box. The doll was beautiful, a rare artifact, a Japanese relic of great historical value. Her blue kimono was impeccable, and her long black hair cascaded down her porcelain back. He didn't know, but Ethan had also been sitting there, in this same spot months ago, and now he was missing. The collector took the box to his car and drove to his apartment in central Tokyo. She placed the doll on a shelf in her office, among other Japanese antiques she had acquired over the years. He felt a certain pride in having obtained such a valuable item. That night, something disturbed his sleep. The apartment was silent, but even so, He woke up more than once with a strange feeling, as if someone was standing there next to the bed, just watching. The next day, he took some photos to catalog the piece in his personal archive. When he opened the images on his computer, his smile slowly disappeared. In the first photo, the doll was exactly where he had left it. In the second, his head appeared to be tilted slightly to the side. In the third, her hands, previously resting in her lap, were slightly raised. The collector felt a chill, blinking several times. That was impossible. He turned to look at the shelf, but the doll remained motionless, exactly as before. He chuckled softly, trying to shake off the discomfort. Maybe it was just an effect of the light. Maybe he was tired. Perhaps. And then, in the silence of the room, he heard a faint whisper. "Why did you bring me?" His eyes widened. His body froze. The cycle had begun again. And Ethan? Nobody ever heard from him again. His name became just one of many that disappeared over the years, victims of a curse that never dies, that never stops, that always finds a new host. Okiku had chosen another, and now the game started again.